welcome to this session. I'm glad you fought your way through the crowds to actually get here. This is really a follow-on from a previous session, but you don't have to have attended the previous session to get anything out of this one. What I'm really demonstrating here is what Microsoft has done in the Windows 10 Full Creators Update to surface up a lot of the investment they've made in the platform to make modern applications look attractive. So, without further ado, this is an app, obviously, that I've created in pretty much the standard way you would build a UWP app. So it has its title bar across the top. It has a grid of contents. You can scroll around. It looks reasonably attractive, but there's nothing special about it. You mouse over these things. I select home. You see the French fry is what Microsoft calls this, moving around as it shows you what is selected, but there's nothing particularly awesome or amazing about this. If I select one of these items, then I do a fast transition over to this page. I can scroll around. I mean, it looks relatively attractive, but you'd see a similar application, say, on the iPad or whatever, and it would have a lot more pizzazz. There would be a lot of interesting transitions and so on between these things. So let's close this down, and then let's have a look at this. So this is a version of the same application, same code base, that has all the features of the Full Creators Update enabled in it. So I don't know if you can see this, but you see this background is somewhat translucent. So it's bringing through the desktop in there. The same effect is actually applied here. It's a little harder to see. If I move my mouse up onto this news item, do you see a lighting effect start to shine around the items? Yes, you do. So that is a reveal brush. So this is using lighting that applies just to the border around these items. So it's hiding Chrome until you move your mouse over it. Watch as I click this item, do you see this light burst when I click on something? And so this again is using some subtle lighting and so on to illustrate interaction with components. If you watch the French fry on the left here, if I select home, you see how it animates and snaps into position. Select news, snaps down and elongates. Go down to settings, all the way down. These are features that are facilitated by composition. It's using implicit animations to understand, okay, you're moving the top and the bottom of the French fry down to this new location, and it has a delay in the animation between the top and the bottom. So it gives you this stretch and snap effect. It looks like a rubber band moving around. Something somewhat interesting, and I've seen people that just sit there and go, ooh, look at this, and just keep moving backwards and forwards with it. So if we look at, say, our games view here, now watch if I select one of these items. Now we have a connected animation that moves backwards and forwards between these. So it's a lot more interesting. It helps you continue the context from one view to another. So we see how the background image animates in, transitions backwards and forwards between these. We also see how the content pops in afterwards. And if I actually select something with a lighter background, you can see there's a drop shadow around this that wasn't present previously. And as I scroll, we actually have parallax scrolling in the background. You can also see that the title bar is now much more interesting. Our content is extending beyond it, but now we actually have a blur effect as our information slides underneath. It just makes it look much more visually interesting. If I come back to the games view, if I resize this, you now see how the items animate to the new positions rather than just snapping backwards and forwards. So again, it makes the application feel much more alive. We have the side animates and behaves in an interesting way. It lays over the top, so we can now see through to our underlying content. It just gives it some depth and so on. So that's basically what we're going to be building today. Let's jump back to my deck. So my name's Daren May. I'm a Microsoft Windows Developer MVP. You can see me on Twitter at Daren May. And this is the link where you can see all the source code and the slide deck for this presentation. What is the Fluent Design System? Microsoft start talking about that back at Build this year. This year? Yes, this year. And it is them taking their design language forward. So it's still based upon what was created as part of Metro and then got renamed because of a lawsuit to MDL. Metro Design Language is what it stood for, which was really around cleanliness. It was moving away from Chrome, stop trying to pretend you're a velvet desk with cards laid on top of it. Instead, just be genuinely, authentically digital and so on. But they realized they went too far. You know, if you looked at Windows 8, every app looked the same. It was all square tiles and content and so on and so forth. And they realized they needed to bring things back. And they also needed to make things more interesting. So they wanted to introduce motion and so on. So the Fluent design system has 5 key components to it. It has light, the ability to add lighting to your application and make it respond to light. Depth, the idea of having content placed above each other using transparencies and scaling to show that there's more content and depth to this content. Motion, so things move in and out in a pleasing way. Materials such as acrylic that makes everything more interesting. And scale, so that you can actually move things backwards and forwards in the Z order. This becomes increasingly more important as the world embraces mixed reality and virtual reality in its UIs. So the idea behind the Fluent design system and composition is it's a continuum. The idea was actually back in the anniversary update, although they didn't advertise to the general population, was when they first started putting all of these low-level APIs in there to support this capability. They extended it out to audience such as myself and other MVPs to get us using these things and start making recommendations. So the idea was, first of all, they had to make it possible to do something. Then it's taking the possible and making it easy to use so that we can start leveraging those capabilities in our applications, and you don't have to have intrinsic knowledge of all the underlying capabilities in order to use it. And then finally, it's making it the default experience. It's the Windows 10 experience. And in terms of the timeline for that, the first time this stuff was generally available as possible was back in spring for the Creators Update. In the fall Creators Update, they've now baked it into a number of controls to make it very easy to use. And in future releases, what we're using today in special controls will be the default experience. And this cycle is going to continue to repeat because they're not done with Fluent design system. It's going to continue to evolve over time. If you were in my earlier session, you know what I'm talking about with regards to composition. But in summary, it sits between the low-level graphics card APIs and the high-level XAML framework to make it easier to interact with those low-level capabilities. And now the XAML framework is using it by default in some of these controls to give these experiences. You can kind of imagine composition is the velvet comfy cushion that sits between your XAML and your DirectX. So let's dive into the code and start having a look at things. So what I have here is the application that I was just showing before, and it's had a couple of things turned on, but is pretty much in a state ready to start introducing some of this full Creators Update goodness. So what we have by default right now is we've introduced the new navigation view control. And so you can see this has got this transparency going on here. And I haven't applied any custom acrylic to it right now because you can see the lighting effect a little bit better on here. So as my mouse moves around, you can see that there's a lighting that follows the mouse. You guys see that okay? And then as I click, you can see that ring of interaction as I click on these things. And so you get that for free in the navigation view control. What you don't get for free in the navigation view control is actually all the integration into navigation itself. And myself and Jerry Nixon, we've actually built an extension to this control that makes it behave in a way that integrates easily with navigation. He's actually going to publish an article in MSDN magazine next month, which details a lot of this, but we'll be putting it into a library that people can use. So let's just have a look quickly at how that is implemented. So my application is effectively has a shell page, which gets started on startup, and then I have a bunch of views that you navigate through, and that's what the navigation view is controlling. This is the shell page, and in here, this is our extended version of the navigation view control, and it just makes it easier to define your navigation items and to navigate around. So we're not going to worry about talking about that as part of this. One of the first things we're doing is we actually have the ability to override the definition of some brushes. These are resources that are used by the navigation view. And what I've done is by giving it the same name, it overrides the brushes that the navigation view uses to render up its background for its main pane. And so this allows me to create an acrylic brush, which is new to Full Creators Update. And I can specify that its tint color is orange and so on and so forth. So if I run this quickly, the idea behind this is rather than having to understand how to create an effect chain of Gaussian blur with material, with a color tint and so on and so forth, they've now encapsulated this behavior in an acrylic brush that you can use anywhere where you would use a XAML brush. And so now this application has got an orange tint, which allows me to bring my branding into my application and give it that look and feel that's consistent. You know, if you're building for IKEA or whatever, you know, they're going to have their own color set that they want to use. So that's a simple way of just introducing acrylic into my application. If I now have a look at the title bar, one of the differences between the initial version of the application was you had the boring title bar across the top. In the lit up application, we're extending ourselves into the title bar using this value, and we're also setting some transparencies for the buttons so the buttons don't impose too much on your content until you mouse over those. Those people who were in my previous session know about that already. The next thing is we navigate to our home page. So if I just run up the application again. So the home page is showing as opaque right now. So how do we introduce this acrylic background to our home page? So if I close this down, if I go to my home page view, what I've got listed here is these are the typical brushes that you would use. By default, when you create a new page in XAML, it has application page background theme brush. Just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Effectively, it's going to be white if you're in a light theme. It's going to be black if you're in the dark theme. We can change that to use the system control acrylic window brush. If I drop that in, now we're going to have an acrylic. And the difference between a window brush and an element brush is the window brush shows what's behind the window. The element brush shows what's behind the element within the scope of your application. So you'll get transparency within your application using element brushes, transparency outside of your application using a window brush. So if I run this up, I always wish compilation just went so fast. I might have to get a Surface Book 2 just for that. It's my excuse anyway. You know, if you shake a window, it closes down all the other applications. So now you can see we have a transparent value that sits behind. Okay? So already looking amazing. We should ship it, shouldn't we? So now, that's our home, but home isn't particularly interesting, so let's have a look at our main page, which is our articles page. So this is where we have that grid of articles that we're showing. And so that's still not particularly interesting if I run it. You know, we haven't got any cool features or functionality. We snap backwards and forwards between things. We want to make that a little bit more interesting. So one of the key things that we have is this is really kind of ugly, isn't it? When you resize this, it just snaps. From a mental perspective, you don't know where the article goes. You kind of have to look and search for it again. So you want your environment to give you some clues around this. Previously, it was very challenging to do something like this. But we're going to use a capability that's shipped as part of the UWP Community Toolkit, which is the reorder grid animation. So I'm just going to delete that, and I'm going to uncomment this. And now this is using what's called an attached property. Everybody know what attached properties are? I'm not sure you do. An attached property is effectively something declared outside of a control that can be associated with the control statically, and you can then check to see if they exist and take a value. So if you use grid layouts and you use grid.row and grid.column, those are attached properties from a grid that gets injected into child controls that you can specify. So what we're doing here is we're attaching a duration property for a reorder grid animation. When we do this, the animation gets attached to our grid view, and by default, the movements between one location and another using implicit animations, which those in the previous session will now understand, will animate from the starting position to the new 2 position over 300 milliseconds. So if I run this up. So people who were in the previous session, we obviously created all this stuff longhand. Now it's actually starting to be baked into frameworks that make it easy to use. So now as I adjust the window size, everything just animates, and it's just that one line. So this is what I'm talking about on the continuum, making it possible. You can write a whole bunch of code in your code behind to do it, to making it easy. It's now just an attached property you can attach. To making it default, we won't need to specify this on the grid view in the future. It will just do it. Okay? That's the continuum. Okay, so we've got our reorder. Now we actually want to get our interaction where we navigate in a connected way from our grid into our detail view. So let's have a look at how we do that. And so that is going to be in our code behind. So there's nothing special about any of this stuff to enable it. We have some services that have been provided that we can opt into that do the connected animations. So we have 2 phases of a connected animation. We have our source page where we're navigating from, and we have our destination page which we're navigating to. The connected animation bridges between those 2 and looks at which elements are going to be shared between those 2, if that makes sense. That's the connected part. So we're on the articles page, and what we're interested in right now is what happens when we click on an article. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to prepare a connected animation. Now, this used to be a lot more challenging before Fall's Creators Update because you would have to do all of this yourself. Now, they've added an extension method that attaches to a grid, and it says, look in the data template for my grid for a control called image, take the associated selected item in that grid as the backing data element, and create a connected animation called image. So that prepares it. Behind the scenes, what's happening is the connected animation service is finding the container element in the list view, searching inside that data element to find the image control. Then it's going to detach it from this page, float it. The new page is going to get loaded. It's going to work out where that new image, where that image should move to. Then it's going to do an animation between those 2. So let's have a look at the article detail page, code behind, and it makes sense we're looking at the navigated to event inside there. So if we have a look at on navigated to, we've got this code here that is going to turn around and say, okay, find me the animation service for the current view and get an animation called image. If it's found, then it's going to try to start that image, or that animation, I should say, attached to our background image. And that's just an extension method that I created, in actual fact, that will turn around and set my initial image state of my image is opaque, or is transparent, I should say, because you don't want to see where it is. You want to see it move it to there. Then, once the image is opened, it's going to start our connected animation to move it there. And then it unsubscribes from the image opened event, so it tidies up after itself, because you might change that image multiple times whilst you're on this page, and you don't want to have this animation try and rerun each time. Okay? So that's very simple and straightforward. Does that kind of make sense? If I just come in here, I'm going to enable my back navigation on my articles page as well. And what this is it does the opposite sense. When you come back from your articles detail page, the articles detail sets up an animation to move it back to where it came from. And so there's a couple of interesting things we've got to do in there, but let me just make sure that this is all done. So this is my navigate back. Okay, so let's run this. Feel free to ask questions. I mean, there's not many people in here, so if you have questions, by all means do so. Okay, so I'm in here. I select Lara Croft, and it crashes because I haven't set it up properly, apparently. Hooray! Okay. Worst nightmare for presenters when your demo doesn't work. That's what I did. I haven't added in my XAML in my articles page, which wrappers some of these items. So I need to turn on my parallax view and my drop shadow container. So let me quickly talk about the parallax view. The parallax view is a control that ships as part of the new framework that monitors the scroll position of another panel or another control. So I have this scroll viewer here, has an article scroll. The parallax view is bound to the article scroll viewer. It's looking at the property set of that scroll viewer, and it automatically has an expression that we inject in a 50 value for our vertical shift ratio between those two elements. But it understands the dimension of the background image, so you'll never scroll beyond the bounds of your image to set up your animations for your parallax scrolling. So again, something that was incredibly complicated to do as a series of code-behind activities is now just wrapped up in a single control where you have your background image. And that's the image we're actually animating to as well. Make sure I've got everything else. Sorry, second? Did you say something else, or were you pointing out that error? Okay, cool. Thank you. It always helps to have more eyes when you're trying to do all of this stuff. Two more seconds on it, and then we'll move on to the next bit. Articles page animals, yes. We have all of this. We have all of this uncommented. We have all this uncommented. What have I done? Okay, anyway, let's move on. You saw it working beforehand, so you know it's not entirely smoke mirrors. Okay, so the next part was the parallax, as I showed you in the previous demo how that parallax worked. I showed you the drop shadow. So the code for it, as I said, this is, you have to encapsulate the content you want to drop shadow on. The reason for this is your drop shadow has to be put behind your content. They will in the future make it so that you have a drop shadow as a property on a particular control, and it will work it out behind the scenes. But right now, you have to have it behind. And so this is something that comes from the UWP Community Toolkit as a container that puts your drop shadow in. In the future, it will be baked into panels and those sort of things for you directly. So that's that one. Okay, the next thing I wanted to show, if you recall when this one was working, the image moved into the background, and then you had the new content pop in on top of it. Okay? There's an alternative way of doing this, which is a different style of animation, where the content moves and you have other content on that page become attached to it. And so that's you have a connected animation which moves you between two pages. You have a coordinated animation which takes other elements and moves it in concert with the item that's coming across. So let's have a look at that. So we're going to look at our news article page and our news page. So the news article page, we have the grid background. We have our grid. We have a background, what we're calling the background image, but it's actually going to be part of our article. And we have a header block that is next to that. So we're going to have an image, and we're going to have the title. And we want the title to move with the image as we navigate into this page. So in order to achieve that, we have a different set of animations. Now, previously, we had a try start or a start animation that was just based upon the background image. But we can also optionally supply an array of additional elements that also will be animated. And we don't have to set anything else up. The animation gets created automatically for us by the connected animation service. and will move these things based upon the position of that item. So let's run this and see if I manage to mess this one up too. So we're now on a news page. And so if I click on this item, you see how this title moves with it? I'll have to watch for it again. So that is attached to this and is coordinated with it, but I haven't had to set up anything special other than say to the connected animation service, this is a control that's part of the group that should be connected. So it makes these things very, very easy and simple to do. You notice how the back animation still animates this back to where it was located. So that's the from animation connected to it. Any questions so far? It's for anything. You can actually stage it. The grid view or anything that inherits from list view base has a prepare connected animation extension method that you can use. But you can actually do connected animation service .get for current view .prepare animation and pass it a name and an element. And then what you do on the other side of it is just do the same as we just did to find it and run it. So all it's effectively doing is turning around and saying, okay, you're going to tell me the two elements, where it's coming from and where it's going to. What it then does is it takes the backing visual, which is the output of this control, detaches it from this page, attaches it to your frame in actual fact. This one then disappears, but the visual stays here. It then waits until this new image has been rendered. That's why we have the opacity set to 0 on that image, so you don't actually see it, but it knows where it is, and it knows its dimensions. It then grabs the visual of that one, positions that visual here, fades between the two, and then animates and scales into that location. So that's how it's working behind the scenes. Because it's all being run by the system compositor, it's running at 60 frames per second, so we don't see any of the flicker or anything along those lines. And it's not burdening your application with worrying about all of that stuff. Because if we did try and do it in the application, you'd see a flicker. You'd see it be swapped backwards and forwards. You'd see much more of a lag between it. So that's the power of the composition system sitting behind it. The previous session that I was talking about was all these primitives that enable this stuff, but this is how it makes it easy to consume. Make sense? Okay. So in the previous session, I talked about some lighting and so on, and I talked about implicit animations, and I talked about how expression animations. The expression animations is what makes the parallax work. The lighting and other animations that observe alternate inputs, like your pointer positions, that's what I'm going to show a little bit about now. So if we go back to our news page, I'm going to switch in a different title. So this is willfully gratuitous in terms of what it does. I'm not turning around and saying this is what every title in your application should look like. But this is a custom control I've built that leverages lighting, leverages composition, and so on, and would be interesting. So if I go onto the news page, so you see that shimmer effect. So there's an animation going on. You can imagine, obviously, it's a new version of the marquee from the 90s webs. You know, every web should have one. So yes, you can imagine how annoying this would be if your screen was full of this all the time, but that's why it's gratuitous. But there's some other interesting things. As I scroll this up, you can see that it's actually sitting on top of an acrylic, so it gives you a nice effect there. But the other thing that goes on is when I move my mouse in, it's now tracking my mouse position, and it's moving a light with my mouse position. And again, you can see there's no lag or anything like that because the system is monitoring the properties of my pointer and is managing all of this animation for me. I'm not having to do anything to update it. The only thing I'm detecting is when my pointer enters that control, I turn off this repeating shimmering animation, and I switch it over to the implicit animation that tracks my property set for my pointer, entered in, turns off the repeating animation, tracking this. When I exit, I turn off the animation and I turn that back on. Now this is where control developers can really start to build some interesting things. As I say, I can't imagine I'm going to see this in every app moving forward, but let's show how this ties together. So I go to controls. I have this content shimmer control. So this is a regular XAML custom control. How many people have built a custom control in XAML before? Okay, number of people. So I'm actually using a content control as my base rather than control, so you understand what that is. And so also in themes, I have generic.xaml, which defines the template. And as you can see, it's a very, very simple control. It just has a content presenter in there. So there's no real magic going on there, other than the fact it's going to illuminate the content of that control. So now you can see that basic control. If I come back to the title, I'll explain that a little bit more. So you can see here's my control. I can say what my highlight color is. I can specify line height and background colors and all those kind of things. But this is the content. All I have in there is a text block with name. I can put whatever I want in there, in fact. Let's do something unfortunate, which will probably break it. So I've got a button in there now. So now if I run this up, sizing I'll probably jack up, but you'll get the idea. Now if I run this up, because it's just part of a content control, it's been added in, and the illumination, so you can see how the light applies to it. So in the previous talk, you remember how I was talking about as soon as you apply any light, then there's no ambient light. You have to add ambient light. And so this works because we just have a point light moving quickly across the scene, which just illuminates the area within the cone of influence of that point light. If I move my mouse in, then the cone follows my mouse. Okay? So let's have a look at a little bit at how that control is created. So what we have is a regular control, has a bunch of dependency properties that control the different colors, highlight color, and so on and so forth. Really nothing much magical in there. We have the compositor. That is your factory that creates composition objects for you to interact with. Content control, you remember the default style key to go in and pull in your template from XAML, from your resources. So I have loaded and unloaded. This is for life cycle tracking for resources. Pointer entered, pointer exit. So that's where I change my animations over. On apply template, you guys are familiar with that. Once we've got our XAML template loaded, I find my content control. I initialize composition. So composition, as I mentioned in the previous session, you're really defining templates for animations. And so those animations can be reused over and over and over again across multiple instances of actual animations. And so all we do here is we look to see, okay, have I initialized my composition? Have I set these things up? Yes, okay, then I'll reuse them as I need to. And then obviously we apply a template. I have a couple of different animations, my pointer following animation and my repeating animation. The repeating animation is very simple. It's a keyframe animation. It's going to move from the left to the right, so it's actually looking at width to work out how far it needs to animate to and from. So we've got our starting position is frame 0. Frame 1 is our ending position. Apparently it does it in precisely 3.3 seconds. Obviously I felt that was a good speed. And we say it's going to do this iteration forever. So that's why it just sits there going backwards and forwards. And then I start the animation animating the offset X of the light, which moves it horizontally. So that's going to sit there forever until I do something else. This is the pointer following animation. So I have the ability to get my pointer position property set, and it's scoped to my control. So if you remember when I applied the template, I got a reference to my content control in my template. So this will get the pointer position relative to the origins of this control. So then I have my hover position, and I use that to just set the hover position X and hover position Y within a vector 3 as part of my expression animation. So that's define my expression. Then I set a reference parameter for the hover value, which is this value here, is based upon the hover position I obtained from my property set up there. So remember when I was talking before about how there's a lot of reliance upon magic strings? You create expressions as a text string. So it's a little bit challenging to debug if you get it wrong. There is actually a project out there that uses extension methods to construct this in a kind of fluent syntax. So that's a little bit easier. It's more type checked and so on and so forth. But I'm just using the string on here because it's pretty succinct. Height, that's the height the light is above the surface. So the further away, the more diffuse the light is, the closer to the surface it is, obviously the more pinpoint it's going to be. Set scalar parameter. So reference parameter is going to be updating against my property set, so it's going to be monitoring the property set for changes. Scalar is just a single value, and so I have a constant light height, which is being injected into there. And so that's created that animation, so that's ready to go. When my pointer enters, I'm just scrolling down, pointer enter, I stop the repeating animation, and I create a pointer following animation. So all I'm doing there is reapplying this expression animation to the pointer, and that's how it switches backwards and forwards. So it's really very, very simple once you actually see it laid out. Half the problem, as you know, with most APIs is not necessarily understanding what it's doing. Once you see it, it's working out how do I start. And so that's the advantage of having samples like this, is you can have a look and see how those things go. And so that's a more advanced use, but that's what the Windows team is going to be doing, building this stuff into the controls, so it's there by default. You're going to see a lot of these controls get added into things like the UWP community toolkit, so you can use them. I'll probably contribute this to that toolkit at some point once I've got it polished, so people can use it inside their applications. But that's the whole idea of this. I mean, if you guys use Groove, it's in the Groove app, the Windows Microsoft ship. They have a lot of these capabilities, oh, of course. They have a lot of these capabilities enabled by default in their first-party applications, and more of the apps are going to start jumping on board to this. Yeah. That's what happens when your machine rebuilds itself halfway through. So, any questions on what I've showed you so far? I mean, the idea is that this is really going to empower everybody to create applications that look like they're part of the Windows 10 ecosystem. Will some of this move into? Oh, yes, absolutely. So about 2 years ago, I got invited to an SDR, which is a software design review. And we're talking about, okay, what is the best way to do this? Do we put everything in XAML first and realize that we might make mistakes and need to change how it was put into XAML? Or do we focus on creating all the underlying infrastructure first and then experiment with different ways of surfacing it up until we've got enough of an idea of how people want to use it so we can make most of these simple use cases just XAML properties? In answer, yes, that's where they're going with it. That's the continuum. Possible, easy, default. You know, at some point in time, you're going to have drop shadow equals true. Or you're going to have drop shadow distance equals 3, drop shadow direction equals a degree where you want it to be offset, and so on and so forth. You're already getting things like these lights. Let me just show you this. So one of the things that they really want to do is make these things easily consumable. So now you've got this XAML light, which you can just add to your controls. And it will automatically light up your control based upon this position. They have XAML brushes, like the acrylic brush, that you can put anywhere where you would put another brush. So right now, you probably use solid color brush all the time. Anywhere where you use solid color brush, you can put acrylic brush. And you can create your own acrylic brushes and use them, plus any other brush that you want to do. So a basic brush just exposes up a composition surface, which you can do whatever you want on it. So you could create a blur brush. and you can just drop it in anywhere where you would use it. So say, for example, you had your XAML UI, and you had a list, and you wanted to pop something over the top, and you said, oh, I don't want anybody to read this list while this pop-up is on top. You could put a rectangle with a Gaussian blur brush that you've created on top of it, and it will blur it for you. That's the idea, is really to make it easy. People are going to be shipping all different types of brushes, so you have all these different materials that you can use out of the box. So you're not just using acrylic, you're just not using that. You can create your own, or you can use all these different ones, like I've seen people creating ice-style brushes, things that look more like the aero effect. And that's an important thing. So you might think about acrylic and go, why do they call it acrylic versus just a Gaussian blur? Well, it's actually 5 effects. Gaussian blur is just one effect. Acrylic has a noise layer, which is another bitmap that they interleave that has an algebraic operation that gets performed based upon what comes through to make it even harder to read what's going on behind it, because they don't want you wasting mental cycles trying to process what's there. And so that's what all of these materials, and if you remember the 5 things that I was talking about in the deck, that's where the materials aspect of this comes from. They're going to be giving you a lot more materials that you used to give you different looks and feels to your applications and so on. You know, and we talked about motion, how animations like that tie it together. So that's really what they're trying to do as part of this ecosystem. Great question. Any others? Okay. Well, if you'd like to learn more about this, Microsoft has a whole site dedicated to talking about the Fluent design system. So you can go on there, fluent.microsoft.com, and see a whole bunch of samples and where they're talking about all the different design metaphors that they're incorporating. They also show pictures of reference designs, and there's going to be more and more controls that come out that enable some of these experiences by default. If you want to learn more about the visual layer, i.e. the capabilities that underlie Fluent, then you want to go out to this location. I don't know if you guys have visited the new docs.microsoft.com, but it's a huge improvement over the MSDN docs that are out there. They're actually open source, the documentation. So if you see a problem, you can actually propose and create a pull request with corrections. If you think that there's a scenario that's being missed, you can create that scenario and propose that it gets added. So it's really becoming much more of a community effort. All the MVPs are doing a lot of contributions to those things as we sort of come out and talk to people and they go, oh, I don't understand that, that's not clear. We're making those changes. The Windows UI Dev Labs, this is the composition team and their reference application they put out there that shows how to use every facet of the composition system. UWP Community Toolkit. This is a very comprehensive library of capabilities that are out there right now. Has more than just composition in there, has other helpers, controls. It has, as an example, it has a text box or text block that displays Markdown. So it'll actually do a full render of Markdown, but it's actually using text blocks and runs and effectively very similar to rich text being presented. So it's very useful control. Lots of people contributing to it. I occasionally wax lyrical on Daren May at Twitter, and now I've got 280 characters, fear me. Got a website out there for my company, CustomMayd, and all of the source and this deck is out on GitHub at this location. Okay. If you have no more questions, thank you very much for your time, everybody.